Hezekiah repaired the doors of the Lord's temple and made them strong. He opened the temple again. He did this in the first month of the first year after he became king. Hezekiah called the priests and Levites together in one assembly. He had a meeting with them in the courtyard on the east side of the temple. Hezekiah said to them, "Listen to me, Levites. Make yourselves ready for holy service. Make the temple of the Lord God ready for holy service. He is the God your ancestors obeyed. Take away the things from the temple that don't belong in there. These things make the temple unclean. Our ancestors were not faithful and did what the Lord said was evil. They stopped following him. They no longer paid attention to the Lord's house and turned their backs on him. They shut the doors of the porch of the temple and let the fire go out in the lamps. They stopped burning incense and offering burnt offerings in the holy place to the God of Israel. So the Lord became very angry with the people of Judah and Jerusalem. He punished them so badly that it shocks and scares people to hear about it. But then they just laugh and shout their own insults against Judah. You know this is true. You have seen it happen. That is why our ancestors were killed in battle. Our sons, daughters, and wives were made prisoners. So now I, Hezekiah, have decided to make an agreement with the Lord, the God of Israel. Then he will not be angry with us anymore. So, my sons, don't be lazy or waste any more time. The Lord chose you to serve him in the temple and to burn incense." This is a list of the Levites who started to work. From the Kohath family, there were Maath, son of Amasai, and Joel, son of Azariah. From the Merari family, there were Kish, son of Abdi, and Azariah, son of Jehalel. From the Gershon family, there were Joah, son of Zimmah, and Eden, son of Joab. From Elizaphan's descendants, there were Shimri and Jeiel. From Asaph's descendants, there were Zechariah and Mattaniah. From Heman's descendants, there were Jeiel and Shimei. From Jeduthun's descendants, there were Shemaiah and Uziel. Then these Levites gathered their brothers together and made themselves ready for holy service in the temple. They obeyed the king's command that came from the Lord. They went into the Lord's temple to clean it. The priests went into the inside part of the Lord's temple to clean it. They took out all the unclean things they found there. They brought the unclean things out of the courtyard of the Lord's temple. Then the Levites took these things out to the Kidron Valley. On the first day of the first month, the Levites began to make the temple ready for holy service. By the 8th day, they had finished cleaning all the area up to the porch of the Lord's temple. For 8 more days, they cleaned the Lord's temple itself to make it ready for holy use. They finished on the 16th day of the first month. Then they went to King Hezekiah and said to him, "King Hezekiah, we cleaned all the Lord's temple and the altar for burning offerings and all the things in the temple. We cleaned the table for the rows of bread with all the things used for that table." During the time that Ahaz was king, he rebelled against God. He threw away many of the things that were in the temple. But we repaired all those things and made them ready for their special use. They are now in front of the Lord's altar. King Hezekiah gathered the city officials and went up to the temple of the Lord early the next morning. They brought 7 bulls, 7 rams, 7 lambs, and 7 young male goats. These animals were for a sin offering for the kingdom of Judah, for the holy place to make it clean, and for the people of Judah. King Hezekiah commanded the priests who were descendants of Aaron to offer these animals on the Lord's altar. So the priests killed the bulls and kept the blood. Then they sprinkled the bull's blood on the altar. Then they killed the rams and sprinkled the ram's blood on the altar. Then they killed the lambs and sprinkled the lamb's blood on the altar. Then the priests brought the male goats in front of the king, and the people gathered together. The goats were the sin offering. The priests put their hands on the goats and killed the goats. They made a sin offering with the goat's blood on the altar. They did this so that God would forgive the sins of the Israelites. The king said that the burnt offering and the sin offering should be made for all the Israelites. King Hezekiah put the Levites in the Lord's temple with cymbals, harps, and lyres, as David, Gad, the king's seer, and the prophet Nathan had commanded. This command came from the Lord through his prophets. So the Levites stood ready with David's instruments of music, and the priests stood ready with their trumpets. Then Hezekiah gave the order to sacrifice the burnt offering on the altar. When the burnt offering began, singing to the Lord also began. The trumpets were blown, and the instruments of David, king of Israel, were played. All the assembly bowed down, the musicians sang, and the trumpet players blew their trumpets until the burnt offering was finished. After the sacrifices were finished, King Hezekiah and all the people with him bowed down and worshipped. King Hezekiah and his officials ordered the Levites to give praise to the Lord. They sang songs that David and Asaph the seer had written. They praised God and became happy. They all bowed and worshiped God. Hezekiah said, "Now you people of Judah have given yourselves to the Lord. Come near and bring sacrifices and thank offerings to the Lord's temple." Then the people brought sacrifices and thank offerings. Anyone who wanted to also brought burnt offerings. This is how many burnt offerings the assembly brought to the temple: 70 bulls, 100 rams, and 200 lambs. All these animals were sacrificed as burnt offerings to the Lord. There were also 600 bulls and 3,000 sheep and goats that were sacrificed as holy offerings. But there were not enough priests to skin and cut up all the animals for the burnt offerings. So their relatives, the Levites, helped them until the work was finished and until other priests could make themselves ready for holy service. The Levites had been more serious than the priests about making themselves ready to serve. There were many burnt offerings, and the fat of fellowship offerings and drink offerings. So the service in the Lord's temple began again. Hezekiah and the people were very happy about the things God prepared for his people, and they were happy he did it so quickly. King Hezekiah sent messages to all the people of Israel and Judah. He wrote letters to the people of Ephraim and Manasseh also. He invited all these people to come to the Lord's temple in Jerusalem, so that they all could celebrate the Passover for the Lord, the God of Israel. King Hezekiah agreed with all his officials and all the assembly in Jerusalem to have the Passover in the second month. They could not celebrate the Passover festival at the regular time, because not enough priests had made themselves ready for holy service, and the people had not gathered in Jerusalem. The agreement satisfied King Hezekiah and all the assembly. So they sent the announcement throughout Israel, from the town of Beersheba all the way to the town of Dan. They told the people to come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover for the Lord, the God of Israel. Not many people had been celebrating it as it was described in the law. So the messengers took the king's letters all through Israel and Judah. This is what the letter said: "Children of Israel, turn back to the Lord, the God who Abraham, Isaac, and Israel obeyed. Then God will come back to you who are still alive and have escaped from the kings of Assyria. Don't be like your fathers or your brothers. The Lord was their God, but they turned against him. So we made people hate them and speak evil about them. You can see with your own eyes that this is true. Don't be stubborn as your ancestors were, but obey the Lord with a willing heart. Come to the temple that he has made to be holy forever. Serve the Lord your God. Then his fearful anger will turn away from you. If you come back and obey the Lord, your relatives and your children will find mercy from the people who captured them, and your relatives and your children will come back to this land. The Lord your God is kind and merciful. He will not turn away from you if you come back to him." The messengers went to every town in the area of Ephraim and Manasseh. They went all the way to the area of Zebulun, but the people laughed at the messengers and made fun of them. But some men from the areas of Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun humbled themselves and went to Jerusalem. Also, in Judah, God's power united the people so that they would obey the king and his officials concerning the word of the Lord. Many people came together in Jerusalem to celebrate the festivals of unleavened bread in the second month. It was a very large crowd. The people took away the altars in Jerusalem that were for false gods and all the incense altars that were for false gods. They threw them into the Kidron Valley. Then they killed the Passover lamb on the 14th day of the second month. The priests and the Levites felt ashamed. They made themselves ready for holy service. The priests and the Levites brought burnt offerings into the Lord's temple. They took their regular places in the temple as described in the law of Moses, the man of God. The Levites gave the blood to the priest. Then the priest sprinkled the blood on the altar. There were many people in the group who had not made themselves ready for holy service, so they were not permitted to kill the Passover lambs. That is why the Levites were responsible for killing the Passover lambs for everyone who was not clean. The Levites made each lamb holy for the Lord. Many people from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, and Zebulun had not prepared themselves in the right way for the Passover festival. They did not celebrate the Passover the right way, as the law of Moses says. But Hezekiah prayed for the people. So he said this prayer: "Lord God, you are good. These people sincerely wanted to worship you in the right way, but they did not make themselves clean, as the law says. Please forgive these people. You are the Lord, the God our ancestors worshipped. Forgive them, even if they did not make themselves clean, as the rules of the most holy place say." The Lord listened to King Hezekiah's prayer and forgave the people. The people of Israel in Jerusalem celebrated the festival of unleavened bread with great joy for 7 days. And the Levites and priests praised the Lord every day with all their strength. King Hezekiah encouraged all the Levites who understood very well how to do the service of the Lord. The people celebrated the festival for 7 days and offered fellowship offerings. They gave thanks and praise to the Lord, the God of their ancestors. All the people agreed to stay 7 more days. They were joyful as they celebrated the Passover for 7 more days. King Hezekiah of Judah gave 1,000 bulls and 7,000 sheep to the assembly to kill and eat. The leaders gave 1,000 bulls and 10,000 sheep to the assembly. Many priests prepared themselves for holy service. All the assembly of Judah, the priests, the Levites, all the assembly who came from Israel, and the travelers who came from Israel and moved to Judah, all these people were very happy. So there was much joy in Jerusalem. There had not been a celebration like this since the time of Solomon, son of King David of Israel. The priests and the Levites stood up and asked God to bless the people, and he heard them. Their prayer came up to heaven, the holy places where he lives. When the Passover celebration was finished, the Israelites who were in Jerusalem for Passover went out to the towns of Judah. Then they smashed the stone idols that were in the towns. These stone idols were used to worship false gods. They also cut down the Asherah poles, and they destroyed the high places and the altars all through the areas of Judah and Benjamin. They did the same things in the area of Ephraim and Manasseh. They did these things until they destroyed all the things used for worshiping the false gods. Then all the Israelites went back home to their own towns. The priests and Levites had been divided into groups, and each group had its own special job to do. So King Hezekiah told these groups to begin doing their jobs again. So the priests and Levites again had the job of offering the burnt offerings and the fellowship offerings. And they had the job of serving in the temple and singing and praising God by the doors to the Lord's house. Hezekiah gave some of his own animals to be offered as the burnt offerings. These animals were used for the daily burnt offerings that were given each morning and each evening. They were offered on the Sabbath days, during new moon celebrations, and on other special meeting days, as law of the Lord's command. The people were supposed to give a part of their crops and things to the priests and Levites. So Hezekiah commanded the people living in Jerusalem to give them their share. In that way, the priests and Levites could spend all of their own time doing what the law of the Lord told them to do. People all around the country heard about this command. So the Israelites gave the first part of their harvest of grain, grapes, oil, honey, and all the things they grew in their fields. They brought 1/10 of all these many things. The men of Israel and Judah, living in the towns of Judah, also brought 1/10 of their cattle and sheep. They also brought 1/10 of the things that were put in a special place that was only for the Lord their God. They brought all these things and put them in piles. The people began to bring these things in the 3rd month, and they finished bringing the collection in the 7th month. When Hezekiah and the leaders came, they saw the piles of things that were collected. They praised the Lord and his people, the Israelites. Then Hezekiah asked the priests and the Levites about the piles of things. Azariah the high priest from Zadok's family said to Hezekiah, "From the time that the people started bringing the offerings into the Lord's house, we have had plenty to eat. We have eaten until we are full, and there is still plenty left over. The Lord has really blessed his people. That is why we have so much left over." Then Hezekiah commanded the priests to make storerooms ready in the Lord's temple. So this was done. Then the priests brought the offerings, tithes, and other things that were to be given only to God. All these things collected were put in the storerooms in the temple. Conaniah, the Levite, was in charge of everything that was collected. Shimei was second in charge of these things. Shimei was Conaniah's brother. Conaniah and his brother Shimei were supervisors of these men: Jeiel, Azaziah, Naath, Asahel, Jeremoth, Jozabad, Eliel, Ismachiah, Maath, and Benaiah. King Hezekiah and Azariah, the official in charge of God's temple, chose these men. Korah was in charge of the offerings that the people freely gave to God. He was responsible for giving out the collections that were given to the Lord. And he was responsible for giving out the gifts that had been made holy. Korah was the gatekeeper at the east gate. His father's name was Imnah, the Levite. Eden, Menamin, Jeshua, Shemaiah, and Moriah, and Shechaniah helped Korah. These men served faithfully in the towns where the priests were living. They gave the collection of things to their relatives in each group of priests. They gave the same things to the more important people and to the less important. These men also gave the collection of things to the males 3 years old and older who had their names in the Levite family histories. All these males were to enter the Lord's temple for daily service to do the things they were responsible to do. Each group of Levites had their own responsibility. The priests were given their part of the collection. This was done by families, in the way that they were listed in the family histories. The Levites who were 20 years old and older were given the part of the collection, according to their groups and responsibilities. The Levites' babies, wives, sons, and daughters also got part of the collection. This was done for all the Levites who were listed in the family histories. This was because the Levites were faithful to always keep themselves holy and ready for service. Some of Aaron's descendants, the priests, lived in the towns or on farms near the towns where the Levites were living. Men were chosen by name in each of these towns to give part of the collection to these descendants of Aaron. All the males and those named in the family histories of the Levites got part of the collection. So King Hezekiah did those good things in all Judah. He did what was good and right and faithful before the Lord his God. He had success in every work he began, the service of God's temple, and in obeying the law and commands, and in following his God. Hezekiah did all these things with all his heart.